Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Love Doesn't Hurt podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Leonard. So today we'll be talking about emotional and verbal abuse to continue the series of episodes on the different types of abuse. I'm covering these topics together because verbal abuse falls under the umbrella of emotional abuse, but it encompasses a lot, so it should be covered as its own topic. Verbal abuse is easier to identify from an outside perspective than general emotional abuse, but is more subtle than physical abuse. Verbal abuse is defined as a type of psychological abuse that involves the use of oral, gestured, and written language directed at the victim. It includes the use of derogatory terms and statements intended to frighten, humiliate, or belittle a person. Another large part of verbal abuse is gaslighting, which is used to make victims feel crazy or like they're the ones in the wrong, but I'll discuss this more in depth in another episode. Verbal abuse is used to attack the victim's self-confidence and self-worth in order to make them feel powerless. Examples of verbal abuse in relationships include constant criticism, humiliation, accusations of cheating, the abuser telling the victim they're lucky to have them, and the abuser blaming the victim for their abusive behaviors. Of course, these are only a few examples, and there are many more. Verbal abuse attacks and manipulates the psyche of victims and often leaves them feeling like they're crazy and responsible for the abuse they're enduring. Emotional abuse, also referred to as psychological abuse, is defined generally as a form of abuse characterized by a person subjecting or exposing another person to behavior that may result in psychological trauma. More specific to intimate relationships and domestic violence, there are 4 types of emotional abuse. The first type is denigrating damage to a partner's self-image or esteem, which refers to verbal abuse, but specifically verbal aggression that is delivered as profane and derogatory. An example of this would be insults or humiliation, especially in front of other people. Oftentimes, these can be disguised as jokes made by the abuser. The second type is passive-aggressive withholding of emotional support, which refers to an individual intentionally avoiding and withdrawing themselves from their partner in an attempt to be neglectful and emotionally abandoning. This emotional abuse is very deliberate in order to manipulate the victim into doing what the abuser wants and makes victims feel guilty. An example of this type of emotional abuse could include something smaller, like one partner ignoring the other, or even something more extreme, like intentionally being absent when the other partner is going to give birth. The third type of emotional abuse is threatening behavior, which refers to an individual making verbal threats toward their partner that could imply eliciting physical harm, threats of divorce, lying, and threats of reckless behavior that could put their safety at risk. This also falls under verbal abuse. Threatening behavior can also include the abuser threatening to harm themselves in order for the victim to pity them and want to help them, which draws victims back in when they're considering leaving. The final type of emotional abuse is restricting personal territory and freedom, which refers to the isolation of social support from family and friends. This abuse can include weak personal boundaries and stripping a partner of their autonomy through things like controlling what the victim wears or does. Abusers make victims feel guilty for doing something they enjoy or wearing something they like in order to lower their self-esteem and increase their dependence on the abuser. So now that we know what verbal and emotional abuse are and understand what these types of abuse look like, let's put their severity into perspective with a few statistics. Almost half of both women and men have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner in their lifetime. 1 in 5 college women have been verbally abused by a dating partner, and 84% of victims of domestic violence are emotionally abused by their partners. Emotional and verbal abuse are just as damaging as physical abuse, but you can't see the scars and trauma they create on the outside. It takes a lot of therapy and introspection to recover mentally and emotionally after experiencing these types of abuse, because they make victims feel responsible for what they endured. No victim is responsible for their own abuse. Verbal and emotional abuse also leave victims feeling unworthy of love or like they're crazy for being upset about the abuse they suffered. You are worthy of love and respect. You deserve the world and should be treated like it in your relationship. Knowing the ways abusers manipulate their victims and create control is crucial to understanding domestic violence because every situation is different. Educating ourselves so we are able to identify the types of abuse and can help ourselves and others when we recognize them in a relationship is the key to breaking the cycle. If someone reaches out to you concerned that they are being emotionally or verbally abused, be careful how you go about listening and responding. Remember that domestic violence is incredibly common and that whoever is reaching out to you wants help. Saying things like, "Oh, you're overreacting," or "I'm sure you guys will work it out," are like a second wave of abuse to victims. Victims of emotional abuse need support through leaving their abuser, not to be faced with doubt when they reach out for help, because if they are, they may not seek help again while the abuse they're enduring escalates. It is my goal with the Love Doesn't Hurt podcast to create another resource people can use to understand their experiences, get help, and know they're not alone. If you need immediate help, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 or text START in all capital letters to 88788. You can also visit their website, thehotline.org, for more information. Thank you for listening to the Love Doesn't Hurt podcast. I hope you learned a little bit more about verbal and emotional abuse in intimate relationships and how important it is to understand what they look like so we can break the cycle of domestic violence. I hope you all have a great day, and remember, spread love everywhere you go.